Hi, Molly. Welcome to the New Mid. Thank you so much for coming.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks so much for having me. Thrilled to be here.
Well, you are a journalist and television producer. What motivated you to go into this line of work of storytelling?
I am one of those funny people who actually I knew what I wanted to do from a very, very young age, and I stuck with it. I never changed my mind, which I only think is unusual now that I'm a parent myself and my kids seem to change their ideas about what they want to do every week. Um, so I started, I should back up a little bit and say that I grew up in a house of writers. My father's an economist, but he was always writing papers and reading books and a very curious person who traveled the world. And my mother is an author. She's written 5 books. And so she's a Russian historian. So I was kind of always around. I think my home life definitely had an impact on my decision. My parents were always traveling around the world. My father was an international economist, so we grew up right outside Washington D.C. So we always had sort of these crazy dinners filled with people from all over the world and interesting stories. And then we also grew up traveling a lot because of my father's work. So that just sort of from the get-go and from a very young age, I was comfortable jumping on planes and landing in places that I didn't know very well. And then it just became the way that I wanted to live my life and pursue a career and tell people stories and step outside of my comfort zone. And so it seemed like journalism was a great way to do that. In addition to that, I just was never very good at math and science. So, the path of least resistance. I was an
That's
English major in college. So, and then really, then of course, once I was able to start writing, I think from early as my elementary school newspaper I was involved in, and then my high school paper. I was a columnist for my college newspaper and then went to journalism school. So I guess it's just in my blood.
well, that's fantastic. Traveling and being a journalist, you're away a lot. So how have you been able to manage having kids and juggle your career?
That's a really great question. It's one that I struggle with even today. My kids are now 10 and 13. When they were very young, babies, I actually did do a lot of traveling. At that point, I was working in television for PBS, and I was doing a lot of and documentary production. And so I was traveling around the world a lot. And it was extremely difficult. I mean, you kind of have to, I guess the short answer is that I had family support. And if I hadn't, I wouldn't have been able to do it. So I had fortunately, my own mother who lives nearby and my mother-in-law who lives not too far. And they would kind of swoop in and support me because my husband works a lot. Um, and then to be honest, as they got older, the older they got, I wish I could say it got easier. It got a little bit harder. I think that's for a couple of reasons. I mean, it always just depends on the kids, but when they were babies, I mean, it was hard to leave them when they were little, but they didn't know. They had no concept of time. It was just kind of like, mom's gone, mom will be back. Everything was the same. The older they got, I felt like the harder it got for them. And so I did actually end up scaling back my travel made a conscious decision to do that a couple of years ago. I was traveling a lot to Africa, and it was taking me, 2 days to get there, 2 days to get home. Being away for 10 days was just too painful. And as a parent, you don't want to miss things. And so I think, now I'm actually deliberately choosing positions that keep me at home. And at this stage, I don't really feel like I'm sacrificing much. And certainly now, it's just not a good time to be traveling. And everybody's hunkered down at home anyway. So
That's true. Yes, we all are experiencing that. Well, since your mom wrote so many books, it's exciting because you've written your own books. And with 9/11 coming up, the anniversary, your book, No Better Time, is very relevant. And what was your motivation behind the book? And how did you get access to the elements of the story? Would you want to tell us a little bit about it?
I'd love to. I think it was about a year or two before the 10th anniversary of September 11th. I was actually just in conversation with a friend, and he mentioned little kernels or pieces of this story about this young mathematician, Danny Lewin, who had been a victim of September 11th. And the story kind of started slowly. And then the more he started talking to me, the way I describe it, I mean, by the end of the story, my jaw almost dropped. I could not believe that this had happened. And I think even more so, I couldn't believe that I'd never heard the story before. To back up a little bit, 9/11, like it did for all of us, really informed my life in many ways. I was living in New York City at the time. I was very fortunate in that I didn't lose anybody close to me, but I'd been living in the city for years. And so I had a lot of friends who had close calls. I had, physically, we were close by the site. It was an extremely difficult year. And it also happened to be the exact week that I started a graduate program in journalism in the city. So it kind of just informed my whole year. I was in graduate school, basically learning techniques on reporting news and during the biggest news event in the country, in decades, arguably, or years. And so I ended up I ended up for assignment for school doing a bunch of stories related to September 11th. And I thought I had read every incredible story from that day of heroism and tragedy. And so I was really stunned to find that a decade later, there was this story that then became my book that I'd never heard about. And there's, this saying that people say truth is stranger than fiction. And when I heard Danny's story, I thought this can't be true. Elements of this are probably exaggerated because it was so extraordinary is really the only word, I could use. So the story came to me really just through a friend, but I think, or I know as a journalist, it's just also in my DNA and in my nature to always be listening for stories. And I've never really had a specific niche that I've covered. I've had topics that I'm interested in, but when people say, oh, what do you mostly write about or produce stories on? It's just anything that I find interesting and important. And Danny's story just grabbed me in a way, I think personally, that I couldn't let go of. The more I read about him and the more I just started to think what motivated this young man, who became this sort of unsung hero of 9/11, who died at such a young age, but accomplished so much in such a short bit of time. And I couldn't let go of it. I couldn't let go of the story. And I couldn't believe that no one had done it. And by the end of that conversation, I said to this friend of Danny's, I said, I would like to write this story someday. Could you introduce me to his friend? And do you think they will let me? And sort of took off from there.
How was that interviewing the family and how are they doing?
Incredibly difficult. I mean, anybody who loses a child, it's one of the worst things imaginable. It can happen to anybody. And so, it had been 10 years since Danny died, but I wouldn't say, the wounds were still really raw. And I decided that I would fly to Israel and meet with his parents and speak to them in person and explain to them why I wanted to write the book about their son, and also hopefully gain their trust in me, which I felt like was the most important thing. And so, yeah, it was a little bit nerve-wracking. I mean, in my work as a journalist, part of my job has been to speak to victims of crimes and tragedies and accidents. And I know that's just part of my job. I don't think it ever gets any easier, especially as you become a parent and you put yourself in people's shoes. In many ways, it just gets harder. And I will never forget, they were kind enough to say, okay, we'll meet with you. They were a little resistant at first, but They said, sure, we'll meet with you. And I got on a flight from New York. I just took an overnight flight to Tel Aviv. I I can't remember. I just took a taxi to Jerusalem and just sort of showed up. I mean, I don't speak Hebrew. I had never been to Israel before. And I remember just sort of standing outside the apartment thinking, this is it, like, and in the end, I had a whole list of ideas that I'd written down on paper for sort of pitching to them why I wanted to write the book. And I decided just, when you're faced with that and you walk into a family, I actually arrived and it wasn't just the parents, it was Danny's brothers, their wives, kids, the whole family was there. And so I just decided to scrap the piece of paper and just, be myself, give them the real pitch. Here's really why I want to do this story and why, you've lost Danny, but he continues to inspire people like myself. And I think the book would inspire so many people if I can write it. And fortunately it went really well and they trusted me.
That is great. And it's wonderful to get Danny's story out there. So, how was it getting it published? And if someone is out there with a story who's writing a book, what advice could you give them on getting a book published?
The advice I would give anybody trying to publish a book is tenacity, determination, and a refusal to take no for an answer, because it doesn't really matter if you are John Grisham or Molly Raskin. You are going to face rejection in the book publishing world. It is part and par of the experience. Now, granted, John Grisham probably doesn't get a lot of rejections, but so maybe that's a bad example. But I guess what I'm saying is, I think you just have to keep in mind, no matter how wonderful your story is, how incredible it is, how badly you want to tell it, how many people have encouraged you to tell it, it is still a very competitive business, and one that is driven by a bottom line, driven by decisions that you don't necessarily understand or have any control over, meetings and boardrooms about what topics people are interested in, focus groups. I think it's very easy to take it personally when you get a rejection, because I've been there. And I would just say you've got to sort of develop a thick skin and never lose faith in your story. That's the most important thing. Stay true to the story, believe in it, continue to nurture it, let the rejections roll, because eventually someone will see in it what you see in it. And if you believe in it, then eventually somebody else will too. And when I started pitching this story, I believe when I was writing the proposal, I thought, this is a slam dunk. This is the book. I think I really thought I was writing a bestseller, and that's what it took for me to have the energy and enthusiasm to do it. But oh boy, I had rejections from several huge publishers before anything worked out.
Well, congratulations that it did get published. That is great. And I'm understanding that you are also selling the screenplay and you have two partners. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, that has been a long and rocky process, which is also something that I wouldn't, advise anybody to bank on. That's an equally, if not more, competitive, difficult industry. And it's been through several iterations. I'm hoping to see the story made into a film someday, because I think it would be incredible. I think it's really meant for the screen. I make television, but not movies. And so, yes, I've been involved with partners on this. Not really privy to say anything more, except that I hope that it ends up as a movie someday.
And what an honor, and what an honor for Danny and his family.
Yeah, the more the story grows, the greater his legacy becomes. And that's always been the driving force behind everything that I do with relation to his story, which is that the more I can get out there and tell people the story and talk about it, the more people read the book, the more people feel inspired in the same way that I did. And I've had really incredible, I mean, my favorite responses to the book really have nothing to do with the way it's written or anything I did. It's more that Danny's story has motivated me to go back and do this in my life, or to say, I want to do this and not, get down about the challenges. And yeah, so that's why I did it and
I think,
continue to talk about it.
and it's an inspiring time right now when, 9/11, the anniversary is coming up. We are going through a pandemic, where New York was hit really hard early on. Different places across the country, across the world have been going through this. So it's wonderful to have Danny's story, to have that inspiration, for us, for all of us. And I'm so grateful for you to have told his story.
Well, I appreciate that. I think so. I think it is a difficult time. I mean, I know it's a difficult time, and I have often thought about him over the past couple months, because there have been days just like anybody else where, I have children who have been learning at home, and, an office that closed, and projects that were put on a shelf, that were, in the middle of production, and uh, extended family worried about their health, and all kinds of things. We're all juggling. Everybody is juggling a lot right now. And I have often thought about how Danny Lewin would handle something like this. And that's kind of oftentimes when I slip into that mode of feeling a little bit negative, maybe I'm a little tired, and or the day isn't quite going my way, I think about how he would handle something, and it kind of is a good way to kind of snap me back into a better place, one in which I think more positively, or I think, what's the point in complaining or worrying about this right now? Let's just press ahead. That was always his attitude. Let's just press ahead. We're not going to get down about this challenge or this challenge. Let's just keep our eyes on the goals, and work as hard as we can, and don't lose sight of what it is that you want to accomplish.
I think that's so inspiring that he did press ahead with everything that he had done and built such an amazing company, um, which is incredible. So, in the sense of pushing ahead, we all do, have our need to have wellness and wellness routines and sort of trying to take care of ourselves with everything that we're juggling. So, do you have a wellness routine or advice on how to sort of take care of ourselves during this time?
Well, I think the first and most important thing is to take care of yourself. I think it's very easy at a time like this to get really wrapped up in worries and trying to plan for a future that we can't necessarily plan right now, because we just don't know where we're going to be as a country or a world, in a time when things are changing so much. And so I definitely, I have my own ways of coping, I guess my own wellness methods. I think, first of all, for me, sleep is a big one. I really don't sacrifice sleep. I happen to be a morning person. So even if I have an extraordinary amount of work or deadlines that I'm facing and I'm on a big time crunch, I typically don't stay up really late, because I know that even if I have to get up at 5 in the morning, I'm more productive than I am at 10 at night, which is kind of my cutoff for my brain. Um, I've been practicing yoga for actually since right after September 11th. I started practicing yoga after 9/11 because for the very first time in my life, I was feeling very anxious and very almost panicky, living in the city, worried about what would happen next. I felt shortness of breath a lot, really felt like physical symptoms of anxiety. So I started practicing yoga then, and I haven't given it up since. And I notice when I don't practice for a couple weeks that I start to feel very different, not just physically, but mentally. I start to feel more irritable, less focused, sleep, I don't sleep as well. So yoga is a big part of it for me. Um, Also, I think just taking time away from work and away from the chaos to enjoy the small things. I mean, I have my two kids who I mentioned, and I really try to take a break, a couple times a day. They are home, which is really difficult, and I really, I think it's not good for any child to be home right now full time. But I try to see the silver lining in it, which is that I am able to do things with them that I wasn't able to do when we were all working and going to school and racing to practices. So we've been doing a lot of cooking. That's another one of my wellness activities because it calms me down. It's creative. I enjoy it. My girls and I make my kitchen into a huge mess. Um, and we make food, a lot of food. So that's another wellness tip of mine. I drink too much coffee, but other than that, yeah,
There's
that's
there's water in coffee, so.
there you go, right? It's one of the foods in my house.
So what do you see next up for your career?
Well, right now I'm working uh, at a wonderful production company in New York City called Left Right Television, and am involved in a number of creative projects there that I'm really excited about. It's a difficult time because it's hard to go out and film anything right now, but things are starting to move again at a slow and safe pace. And it is possible to get things done in this new world. It's just everything has to be just a little bit different. It takes a little bit more time. So I'm working on a couple of different television documentary series right now. One of them is historical, largely sort of archival deep dive into history. And the other one is about self-help and self-care. And the show I just finished is just out on Netflix, actually, which is called UnWell. And it's about a deep dive look into the wellness industry and all different aspects of it, both good and bad.
Oh, I'm looking forward to that. That sounds
Yeah.
amazing.
So I'm always juggling, a bunch of different things. And I would love to write another book, but I just, I've been so occupied with my day job and my kids at home that it's been a little tricky.
Yes. Well, I'm sure another book is definitely coming in the works, especially with your background with your parents. It seems like writing is definitely in your world. So,
Oh,
um, I asked my guests two final questions.
sure.
The first one is, what advice would you give your younger self?
Oh, wow. What advice would I give my younger self? Honestly, I would tell my younger self not to spend so much time worrying about things that you can't control. And I think it's just I would do that because I see it today in so many kids. I see it in my own kids. I see it in our culture. There's so much going on. It's so easy to get worried about things and to really get bogged down in it. And um, I think particularly people who have a more creative mind can really get bogged down and worry as well and not think pragmatically. And so now I tell my kids, when they say they're worried about things, I say 99% of the things I worried about when I was your age never happened. Um, and, it's just an unproductive emotion. We all have it. We experience it every day in certain degrees, but to really avoid getting bogged down with the what ifs and
Right.
try and stay in the present moment. And it's difficult and you really have to work at it. And the older I get, the more I realize I actually do have to work at doing that. Whether it be something like yoga or taking a quiet walk, I have to actually work to have that, to stop worrying and stop what if and planning and be in the moment.
Yes, it is. It is all a mindset where you're at because it's so easy to be either in the past, what's happened, or what's going to happen in the future. So I completely relate to you on that. So, my last question is if someone's having a hard time getting started, whether they're having a hard time getting started writing the book that they've always wanted to do or a screenplay, what would you say to them how to help them get started?
So I think a couple simple things. I mean, the first is what I touched on earlier, which is don't lose faith in yourself. It's so easy with a couple of rejections or a couple negative comments or a failed returned email. I'm not hearing back from this person. They must not like it. Don't take it personally and don't get down because of rejection. Rejection is part of the game in the creative field when you're trying to publish or pitch ideas. So that would be the first thing. The second thing I would say would be to use your resources wisely. Reach out to people. I think today we fall victim a lot to just sitting at home and looking for help or support online because it's easier. But in general, really the best way to get your ideas and stories out there is to find advocates for what you're doing. And so I would say, don't be shy about contacting people, asking them for their time face to face. If it has to be over Zoom, then that is what it is. But make those contacts and start to really convey and communicate your enthusiasm for what you're doing to other people, because that's where your idea will catch fire. If you let it sit inside of you and burn, you're going to burn out, I guess, for lack of a better analogy. So if you can talk to other people, creative circles, writer circles, find a community of artists, because the experience is the same whether you're trying to sell your paintings or a book or a TV show or a podcast. It's all how much faith you have in your idea and what can you bring to other people and what do you want to eventually bring to other people with this project or this story. So put it out there and don't be shy about it. Keep the faith and don't take it personally. It's not you.
You know what? I absolutely love that because it's almost selfish for people to hold it in because there's people out there that they can help with their ideas. So I love everything you're saying.
Yeah, and I think one final note would be to just always tell yourself, I've taught writing classes in the past, and what I always say is to anybody who's starting a book or when they ask me about this or say I haven't, gotten this rejection or a small publisher wants to take it, but they're really tiny. I would just say to yourself, if I have an audience of one, that's good enough. And I know it sounds small and it may not be that comforting, but then when you have an experience where that audience of one comes to you and says, oh, really, my life was changed for the better because of your book or your show or your whatever it is, you kind of realize that it is good enough. You don't have to be a best-selling author or the odds of that. That's not about your talent or your ideas or what difference you can make. So you have to have that faith in your story and convey it and be okay with making a huge difference in a smaller circle if that's how it ends up. And it may not.
Yes, that's true. You never know until you try.
You never know until you try. Exactly.
Well, Molly, thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you so much for writing this book about Danny and all, bringing his story to light because he is such an inspiration. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's really been exciting to talk about.